Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Bench. Today we are talking Second Amendment. Beyond the Bench is basically just everything, anything law, and everything that we talk advocacy here at Mountain States Legal Foundation. And we got the wonderful Mike McCoy on today's podcast episode. So welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I think there's a lot to talk about in the Second Amendment. Definitely one of the hottest topics of one right now, and just in general in the Constitution. Who are you? I guess that's the probably the first. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. Asking myself that for 51 years. I am since I've been an attorney, I've been pretty much a lifelong prosecutor for 25 years until I joined Mountain States a year and a half ago now, and switched from criminal law to civil law. So I am an attorney by trade. I'm also a husband and father. I've got 4 kids, and just enjoying life. Yeah.
I love to hear it. And I read somewhere that you were one of 11 total children.
That's right, the youngest.
How does that even work? Yeah, I mean 11 siblings. I could barely deal with one.
Yeah.
You know?
There were 20 years difference between the oldest, who were twins, and me. So they're more like aunts to me than sisters. But we had my parents had just to give you an idea, a custom made round table that sat 13. That they actually had built so that we could all sit around the table together and have dinner every night with the big lazy Susan in the middle, so the food would be put in the middle and it would just get spun around to everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was particularly then growing up, I loved it. Every weekend there was some major event. Every Christmas was 50 people over, and it was just the family. It wasn't like we were having other people. Thanksgiving, my mom made Thanksgiving dinner every year, and so yeah, it was. I loved it. When I first got married to my wife, I said, "Hey, let's have 10 kids," and she said, "No, that's not going to happen," because I wanted to try to replicate it. Yeah. So we ended up with 4, which was good.
It's still going to be a very big family. I think with 4 kids, and
so.
How does that dynamic? Does that dynamic kind of teach you anything? I mean, now that you're a lawyer, I mean, did you see signs of being a kid? Or you were arguing with your siblings all the time? Were you always creating, these, intricate conversations? Like, how did you? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think in a family that big, there was discipline and there was structure. My dad certainly laid down the law and had to, and he instilled that in all of us, right? That, if you want to have a well-functioning household with 13 people in it, there has to be standards, there has to be rules, and you have to abide by them. And that was instilled in me. I went from college to the military, so it was a natural progression for me to go into a very rigid environment like the military. And then to some extent, the law is rigid. Obviously, the minutia on the edges is where we have the arguments, but really there are standards and there are principles that are applied. And so I enjoyed that as far as being a lawyer as well, to have that same structure carry through from my youth all the way up to the present day.
And what really drew you to law in the first place? Was it family dynamic? Was it something outside of more academics? Was it something more personal? What drew you to that, career?
It was actually a movie and a book. I watched the movie first and then read the book, but it was To Kill a Mockingbird. And so I remember I must have been in 2nd or 3rd grade, and my parents showed me the original movie with Gregory Peck. I don't know if there's been another one made, but by far the best movie of the version of that story. And I loved Atticus Finch. I wanted to be Atticus Finch. And I just saw him as a man of principle, and what was his profession? He was an attorney. And so at that age, and for a very minor reason, I guess, I decided I wanted to go on the legal route, and I was kind of committed to it then up until for the rest of my life, certainly throughout my education.
Yeah, very important book, very important principles, and I think that it's interesting to kind of even think where does that I guess being a lawyer and being in the military, not a lot of people think about that, at least not in my personal experience. So what kind of, I don't know, walk me through the mental process of what you were going through and why that decision?
Sure. So I knew I wanted to go to law school. I finished my undergrad degree at UC Davis out in California, but I didn't want to go right into law school. I knew I needed a break because law school was pretty intense. So a lot of my friends went to Europe for the year, went backpacking. I decided to enlist in the Army. So I went off to basic training, went through full basic training, grunt training, and then went to my advanced individual training. So I spent most of that year between college and law school just going through military training, and I was trained as a paralegal. At the time, I would say I don't have my law degree, so I couldn't be a lawyer. And I was assigned to a reserve unit throughout law school, and really got to experience what it was to be a JAG, because obviously the paralegals assist the JAGs. And the JAGs are the military attorneys who do everything from review contracts to prosecute in court martials or defend, depending upon what side they're on, to advise commanders on airstrikes and the laws of war. So that whole career field is just amazing because it opens up so many great opportunities for you. So I knew, based on my experience in the military, that I wanted to go in as a JAG officer after I finished law school. And so I finished law school, passed the bar, summer of 2001, and ended up getting accepted into the Air Force on September 8th of 2001. September 11th obviously happened the following week. And it's interesting, if I hadn't been accepted or if I hadn't passed the bar, I would have stayed with the Army and I would have stayed enlisted because I wouldn't have had I wouldn't have become an officer or a JAG officer. So it's just how one little thing changes the course of your life. And in that case, I did pass the bar. I was accepted into the Air Force JAG program, and I was committed to serving with them for 6 years. So,
was there anything that you weren't expecting or kind of surprising when you joined, like that you may have not been prepared for or might not have known going in as a JAG soldier or officer?
Yeah, it was the opportunities that were opened up to me was more than I thought they would be. I started off in a base legal office doing reviewing of contracts and things like that, administrative separations and discharges. But I ultimately got the opportunity to go to Iraq for a year and work on the Saddam Hussein trials. I was the lowest ranking guy there at the time, so I was assigned to the defense attorneys. And that was interesting. I got to really know and to some extent appreciate the Iraqi defense attorneys who were representing Saddam and his the other high-ranking members of the Ba'ath Party. And then after that, another great opportunity I would have never thought I would have in the military was to go teach at the Air Force Academy. So I spent 2 years teaching law to the cadets at the Air Force Academy. So I wasn't expecting those opportunities, but when they popped up, I took them. And I always tell him, I have a son who's 18 now, and he's thinking about going in the military. It's like, it's such a great course to take, especially when you're starting off. As a brand new attorney, I was given opportunities that no law firm would ever give me because I didn't know what I was doing. But they don't care in the military, right? There's a court martial that needs to be done. Yeah, go in there and do it. I'm like, okay, so
it's an order.
Yeah, exactly.
Not so much a question.
No, it's not. You just salute smartly and you do it. And so it's a little bit of trial by fire, which I think is what most people need. They need to be thrown into things that are uncomfortable, that they don't have a clue what they were doing. I didn't know what I was doing in Iraq. And it was uncomfortable being in a war zone for a year, for sure. But I didn't know what I was doing in the classroom when I first got started. But I learned it, and I think that was the greatest thing I got out of the military was the experience and the exposure. And it's the reason why I encourage young men, particularly young men, to go in the military so that they have that. Because it not only gives you that interesting background, it also matures you. And inevitably it makes you, I think, hopefully a better person. Everyone I've encountered has been. So
a lot of accountability, a lot of consistency, a lot of discipline.
Yep.
Very rigorous schedule at points.
Yeah.
You said, and just to kind of bring it back a little bit, you said you kind of learned some valuable lessons when working with the Iraqi attorneys and defense attorneys. If you don't mind me asking, what were some of the maybe like a surprising or even just valuable lessons that you kind of learned looking on the other side of that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously had no sympathy for their clients. Saddam Hussein was a horrible human being who did horrible things to hundreds of thousands of people in his own country, let alone what he did internationally. But I think I learned, particularly working with these men, that we were miles apart on the issues, miles apart religiously, obviously, miles apart culturally, but there was more that we had in common than we had differences. And I think that's going back to the military, that's another great thing that it does, is it puts you in places where you're exposed to cultures and people and situations that you wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to, and it makes you realize that the world is smaller than you think, and that our interests are more common than we would think, and that pretty much everybody just wants to live free. That's it. They want to live free. They do not want to be under the thumb of a dictator or a tyrant. And these men, even though they were representing dictators and tyrants, also wanted that for themselves and their family. They spoke about America and the West in positive ways and wishing that could be Iraq's experience. And it wasn't then, and sadly I don't think it is today, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a ton of Iraqis out there who would love to have what we have. And it also gives you obviously an appreciation for what we have, for sure.
Did you ever think that playing like such a major role in that justice like side of things? Let me try to phrase this correctly. Do you think that's impacted you going forward towards constitutional law? You know, seeing like being a part of the Saddam Hussein trials. Do you think that's a big part in what drove you to Mountain States?
Yeah, I'll say more kind of at the macro level, as I just said, there's not a lot that separates us from us and people who live in Iraq. And there's not a lot, and I'll say this too, there's not a lot that separates this country from the chaos of Iraq, except for that constitution, right? I mean, that what it does, the system of government it establishes, the checks and balances it puts in place, the separation of powers, that is what is the foundation of this country. That is what provides us our peace, our stability, our prosperity, is the Constitution. And obviously the underlying principles that we have in the Declaration of Independence that support that, but I'm saying that structure, getting back to my youth with my dad, putting structure in the household, putting structure in the military, but putting structure in a country, that's what that Constitution does. It provides that stability that this country needs. Iraq didn't have it. Most of the world doesn't have anything even remotely close to that. And because of that, most of the world is a chaotic piece of, well, it's a mess. it's a dumpster.
The world's crazy.
It is.
The world is crazy.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. I love that point. Do you think if you didn't join the military that you'd be so driven towards the Second Amendment? Or even law?
I think I would have been regardless. I think it as I said, I think it opened up opportunities to me that I would never have had if I'd gone a more traditional legal route. And I think because that had broadened my perspective on not just the Second Amendment, and not just the Constitution, but the whole purpose and function of law and why it's necessary in a society. So yeah, I think it helped certainly advance that goal for me.
And then I find it interesting that in 2021, I read in your bio that you left it all behind after nearly 20 years in prosecution because you had an increasing concern about the state of American education system, and then you became heavily involved in the California Public School Network, as well as becoming a U.S. history teacher on top of that. So what specifically drove you towards that change, and was it your experience in litigation, was it media, was it policy overall?
Yeah, I think, as I just said, how important the Constitution is, and it's not being taught, and our founding principles are not being taught in most schools anymore. And if they are being taught, it's with the asterisk or the caveat that, well, our history somehow should be disregarded or looked upon negatively because we weren't perfect. Nothing man has ever done is perfect, right? And it never will be. Yeah. And certainly the American experiment is not perfect. But no country, no nation state has ever existed that has done more good than this country. And I know I'm impartial, but that's just a fact. And has perpetuated more good beyond its borders to others. And that is based on our founding principles. And they are good and solid principles, and they deserve to be not only upheld, but respected by our children. And the problem is you have teachers teaching kids these days that are not teaching them to love and respect our founding principles. And because of that, they look with shame or just ignorance back at our history. And if you don't know your history, then you have a bad future as a country. If you have a population that doesn't understand and appreciate its history, the future's not looking good. And so I decided to join this public charter school. It's a classical charter school called John Adams Academy in California. Actually, they're opening up a school out here in Colorado too. And their whole mission is to restore America's heritage by developing servant leaders. And so they call them scholars, the student scholars, and they want them to be taught the history of the country, taught the classics, taught the things that we were teaching our American students 100 and 200 years ago, and that worked very, very well. But they're primarily teaching these kids to serve causes greater than themselves, to be servant leaders who step up and take on the mantle, just like our founding fathers did, to risk everything for the sake of a cause greater than themselves. I loved that mission. I wanted to be part of it. And my background is in U.S. history from college, so I started teaching U.S. history. I actually became the dean of discipline at one point for a year. Ooh. So I was, in addition to teaching history, so that can tie it back into and so
down the hammer.
my military came out there too. I would always, with the boys, not necessarily with the girls, although I would offer it to them too. I would say, listen, you have a choice. I caught him doing something minor, I would say you can either knock out 25 push-ups right now, or you can come spend 30 minutes in lunch detention. And I was trying to just instill them, you know what, just for boys in particular, they just need to like knock off some energy and let out some energy. So they would drop in front of me and start knocking out 25 push-ups, and they had to be perft, or otherwise I would not count them. And,
good form.
Good form, everything. So I loved
the elbows.
exactly. I loved doing that. It just, practically speaking, with 4 kids, teaching is not lucrative enough, to say the least, to keep the family going. So I needed to step back into law at that point in time, and that's what brought me back to law. But if money wasn't an issue, I would definitely teach. I loved it that much.
Yeah, big change, especially because you were doing prosecution in, was it California and Illinois prior to?
Yeah, federal. I was a federal prosecutor and a state prosecutor, a district attorney, a deputy district attorney. So, and I did that again from 2002. In military, I was a prosecutor as well. So from 2002 until 2021, 22, and then took 2 years off to go teach. Then went back to the district attorney's office briefly before joining Mountain State. So the vast majority of my experience has been as a prosecutor, and mostly prosecuting drug and gun crimes, domestic violence. I've prosecuted homicides, and some other welfare fraud and things like that, other more white collar type crimes. But yeah, it's been a great experience.
I'm interested to know, did you ever think that playing such a major role on the justice side of those things was ever like too dangerous, or do you think it can be dangerous?
Dangerous for me personally,
as a prosecutor, yeah. Or I mean, even at like those below you or that were following underneath, like I guess your command. I guess that's a horrible way to put it, but
you mean the military or just
more in your time as in California and Illinois.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you're doing some major crimes, a lot of drug, a lot of dealing with a lot of gangs, a lot of violence. Yeah, did you ever find that dangerous?
Sometimes. There was a couple of cases where we were going after the Mexican cartel. We had what are called wires opened up, so we were like trying to find through the telephone calls that were being made between some of the co-conspirators, trying to work our way up the chain to the bigger fish that were actually moving the products across the border. And at times when you're dealing with the cartel, yeah, there's concerns, especially when you start arresting some of the lower ones, that the word will get out that you're the prosecutor. And so there were steps that I took. I never felt directly threatened, but you took certain steps to make sure that your address wasn't listed publicly, that you never talked about your kids, your family, in court, obviously, or in front of these guys. You try to keep as much as you could quiet. But I never felt safe, scared at all. And maybe I should have. I just didn't. And in Iraq, I also probably, now looking back on my time in Iraq, I go, boy, that was a dumb thing to do. Whatever. There was lots of dumb things I did while I was there that were so dangerous. In hindsight, now that 20 years has passed, where I go, God, I thank God I made it through that. But it was more stupid stuff I put myself in, not necessarily a dangerous thing I was being thrust upon me. But you take risks because you love what you're doing, and because you're willing to take those risks, and thank God it's paid off, or at least it hasn't been the opposite of a payoff for me. It's been okay. I've survived.
Sometimes you need a good story.
Yeah.
Just for the plot. Why not?
Yeah. Exactly. Makes it more interesting.
So I guess that brings us to today. Let's move I guess up the timeline a little bit. You're now the director of the Center to Keep and Bear Arms, CKBA, as we say it here at Mountain States. And how would you define the Second Amendment for those who may not be familiar?
Yeah, so I think the Second Amendment is probably the most misunderstood of the amendments.
Why is that?
Just because I think for a long time, a large segment of the population, based on the way it's not written in the best way. Quite frankly,
I think a lot of the Constitution can kind of be defined like that. We were talking with Jim, and he was like, it's pretty simple, but that's really bad if you're a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of gray area.
Yeah, that is the problem. So you have in the Second Amendment, for example, you have two very distinct clauses, and people have confused the order of one versus the other. And the reality is, the Second Amendment was put there because the people were concerned about having to face the same thing they had just overthrown, which is a tyrannical government. In this case, it was the British monarchy that had kind of kept them under its boot for too long, and had made them not just pay taxes or exorbitant taxes or unfair taxes, but in essence increasingly restricted their liberties and what they deemed to be what they were entitled to as freeborn men. And they didn't want that to happen again, but they were smart enough to look at a history of the world leading up to that point to say that the natural progression of a government is to become tyrannical. So no matter how well-intentioned this new government we were setting up in 1789 in America was, they were not so naive as to think that it's always going to be like that. Even though they were putting lots of, as I said, checks and balances in to prevent any one branch becoming too powerful or becoming an overly strong and dictatorial executive from developing, they knew that that was a possibility in the future. So they wanted to ensure that the people had the ability, if need be, to rise up yet again, like they did in 1775 in Lexington and Concord, grab their firearms behind their doors or above their mantles, and go out and push back against the power of the government. And if they did not have that ability, if they were disarmed by the government, well, then that would be one less check against the government. So in a way, the Second Amendment is, like all the other checks and balances in the Constitution, is a check against the government. But the check belongs to us, the people. It is our check against a government that may, at some point in the future, become too tyrannical and needs to be pushed back on.
You said that there's 2 clauses to the Second Amendment as well. So could you define kind of what those are, or I guess, and just in general, what are the rules or parameters of the Second Amendment?
Yeah, I mean, so the Second Amendment, initially people would say, well, this applied to the militia, right? That they were really speaking about the militia, which in modern day parlance would be the National Guard. And so what this is saying is the states have a need and a right to have a strong National Guard that could be called upon for federal service if necessary. And so the right of the people to keep and bear arms, which is the second clause, should not be infringed. But you have to see that as a scale. And without getting into too much history, after we won the revolution, the country was in turmoil because we did not have a strong centralized government, right? We were operating then not under the Constitution, but under the Articles of Confederation, which were basically worthless. They required all the states to agree on something before it would be passed into law. So 13 of the 13 states had to agree. There was no ability to collect taxes. There was no real centralized executive. And so because of that, there was chaos. And so that was the impetus for the founders to say, okay, we need a constitution and we need to establish a strong centralized government that can kind of, hold some control over the 13 individual states. But the people were naturally and understandably concerned about that for the reasons I just said. We just got rid of a king and a parliament and a monarchy. We don't want that again. So you're saying you're going to do a constitution that seems to be putting many of those things back into place.
Copy-paste.
Exactly. And it really wasn't. But I can understand the impression as to why most of Americans would fear that, if not think that to be true. And so there was this concern, and so to address that concern, people like Madison and Hamilton and others through the Federalist Papers and then eventually through the presentation of the Second Amendment said, listen, we need to have a centralized government. Part of that centralized government is also going to be the ability for that government to federalize the state militias if need be in order to defend us against an attack from a foreign force or to deal with an insurrection in the country itself. But we understand that, so that's the first clause, the need for a strong militia on one side. But on the separate side is that in exchange for that, we are not going to infringe on your ability, people, to keep and bear arms. So it was a balancing that on one hand, we need a strong army, a strong military. On the other hand, that military could potentially be used against the people. So to counteract that threat, the people will have the right to keep and bear arms, and that right will not be infringed. Again, going back to the idea that the whole point of the Second Amendment is to prevent, or at least limit the possibility, make it less likely, that the government would ever become so tyrannical that it would take over too much power and make our lives, or in any way infringe upon our rights, including the right to defend ourselves.
We see that all across the world, whether you're looking at countries like Venezuela, like North Korea, these dictator countries where the government has taken over. And it kind of ensures that right of self-defense. Everybody has that right towards self-defense and not being overpowered.
Correct. And I would even say there's a very concerning example in the West on it. Australia, I think, banned firearms back in, I think, the early 2000s. I don't know the exact time frame. The Australian government's response and reaction to COVID-19, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but was over the top. I mean, they were actually rounding people up who were refusing the vaccine. And there's the argument, which I actually believe wholeheartedly, that if the Australians still had the ability to keep and bear arms, the government would not have moved as far as it did in response to COVID, the Australian government, I mean. Again, it acts as a check of the people. Right? They're not going to go barreling into someone's house to pull them out because they haven't taken the vaccine or because they were seen walking around without a mask. They're not going to do that so quickly if they know that there's a possibility that the person in that house has a firearm to protect themselves from that very type of tyrannical activity, in my opinion, from the government.
Yeah, you could say the same thing, especially for firearms. I mean, if they were like, let's get rid of all of them tomorrow, they would have to march into your homes and into your places of families and comfort and forcibly take them from the public, the people.
And they would never get rid of them. I think there's 300 million firearms, we believe, in the United States right now. So let's say they outlaw them tomorrow. What's going to happen to those 300 million firearms, right? Are they going to come and collect them?
They're just going to poof.
Yeah, they're not going to go away. But what likely will happen to them over time is that they will be possessed by the bad guys. And that's going back to my time as an assistant U.S. attorney. Every drug case I had a gun component to it, and every gun we would seize, sitting next to the cocaine or the meth or whatever drug we were trying to seize at that point in time, was stolen. It was illegally acquired. So all these laws that limit the ability of people to keep and bear arms, they do nothing to the criminal. The criminal's got to get their gun regardless. They're not following those laws. It just makes it harder for the good guys, the law-abiding citizens, to get the firearms they need to defend themselves from the drug dealers, from those who pose a danger to them, and potentially from the government itself. That's what it's doing.
Theory of prohibition.
Theory of prohibition, but again, alcohol didn't go away.
Yeah.
It just became criminal, and it was just used by the criminals to develop a criminal enterprise that made them tons of money. The same thing would happen with guns. They would still be there, but now they'd only be in the hands of the criminals. The best thing to counter a bad guy with a gun, right? The old saying goes, is a good guy with a gun. And the more you pass these laws which infringe on people's right to keep and bear, the more you're making it difficult for the good guys to possess guns. You're not doing anything to stop the bad guys from possessing them. They will always possess them.
And you were talking about concerns out in the West, which kind of makes me want to bring up Garcia versus Polis, as well as your involvement in that. So can you give me a rundown of that case and why MSLF is involved and why your ears kind of perk up even when you hear that case?
Yeah, so Garcia is one of 3 waiting period cases we have. And these are firearms waiting period cases, which we like to refer to as cooling off waiting periods. And why I say it's cooling off is because these 3 laws that were challenging, one in Colorado with Garcia, the other in New Mexico with the Ortega case, and the third one in Florida with the Dunn case. They were all put in place, these laws, to basically try to reduce what the government refers to as impulsivity. The government operates on the presumption that anyone who goes to buy a gun is inherently impulsive, and that they're likely to use it to harm themselves or someone else. And so because of that, you need to impose a 3-day cooling off period, so that they go and buy the gun, but they can't take possession of it for 3 days or 7 days in the case of New Mexico, or 10 days in the case of California, so that they can spend some time reflecting on why they're getting the gun and considering if they want to use it for good or for bad. And that once those 3, 7, or 10 days pass, if they were likely to be impulsive initially, they're less likely to be impulsive now. Well, that's BS, in my opinion. I think it's nonsense. It's also dangerous. I think I said that as a prosecutor, I did a lot of domestic violence cases. And also homicides. The 2 homicide cases involving females that I was involved in, both of those cases involved women who had been long time, they'd been abused by their husbands. They were domestic violence survivors, or in one case, their boyfriend. They reported, finally, after many instances of being abused, they finally reported to the police. Their husband or boyfriend was arrested. And in California, this is not surprising, they were immediately released on bail. So now the female who's the victim has whacked the beehive, right? And by reporting this, she's put herself in jeopardy. The hornets are coming out to get her. And she doesn't have a gun. So she goes into a gun store in California and says, hey, I'd like to buy a gun. Great. She passes her background check. The cooling off periods have nothing to do with background checks. She pays the money, she pays the taxes, she fills out the paperwork, and the gun store owner says, great, you can have your firearm in 10 business days. Come back in basically 2 weeks. She's dead within 7 days. In the case of the 2 victims I had, they were dead within 7 days of reporting. The scenario I'm giving you of the woman going into the gun store is not these 2 women necessarily. I don't know if they went into a gun store not to try to get a gun. But the fact of the matter is you have lots of women like that, domestic violence survivors, who are in a very critical period right after they report their abuser. They need a gun. And so telling them they have to wait, even though they're law-abiding, even though they have a direct need to defend themselves, is dangerous and ridiculous. And so these laws, again, they're not targeted at the criminals. It's all of us going into a gun store. We pass our background check, usually in 15 minutes. We are deemed by the federal government to be allowed to possess a firearm. There's no red flags whatsoever. But these laws say you can't take that firearm for some arbitrary period of time because you know what? Anyone who wants to buy a gun is, inherently impulsive, and we're going to stop you from using it for impulsive purposes. Well, in our opinion, that is unconstitutional, right? That's what the Second Amendment says you can't do. You cannot infringe on the right of people to keep and bear arms. And by preventing them from acquiring a firearm, that is, by definition, infringing on that right. You can't possess the thing you're trying to use, the constitutionally protected thing you're trying to exercise. And because of that, we've challenged them. We've challenged them in 3 different states because the goal is eventually not to get good decisions in each of those 3 states. We hope to. But regardless of the decisions, we want a decision at the federal level, at the Supreme Court, that would then wipe out these cooling off style waiting periods throughout the entire country.
And there's always that argument of like, if somebody's going to commit violence, they're going to commit violence. They're not going to wait 3, even if they had to wait 3 to 10 days. And I don't know, it just seems a bit silly. Even if you were to water down that logic to the example of like candy, right? I'll give you this piece of candy. However, you got to wait 3 days to think about the health and worry benefits. If you have the Snickers, what are the long-term effects?
You're going to put on a pound. Guess what? They're probably going to eat it 3 days from now, too.
I don't think obesity rates will go down really much here in this country, unfortunately.
Or more likely, quite frankly, is they'll go and get the Snickers somewhere else where there isn't a delay. And again, that gets back to my comment. The vast majority of gun crimes that occur in this country, over 90%, are committed by criminals. Right, people who and by firearms that have been acquired illegally, without going through an FFL, without going through background checks. So who do these laws hurt? They don't hurt the criminals. They don't reduce that kind of street violence, which is the vast majority of the firearm-related homicides we see. No, they hurt law-abiding citizens, many of whom may need a firearm sooner than 7 days after they purchase it.
Do you believe this 3-day waiting period is sort of a mask for the underlying push for prohibition on guns by the government? Or how does this case fit into the larger legal battle?
Sure, they all are. All these laws are. The waiting period laws, the other law we've challenged, which is Senate Bill 3 here in Colorado, which is effectively a permit to purchase scheme to outlaw the most common firearms in the state. They're all efforts by the anti-gun folks to slowly chip away at our Second Amendment rights. They want to make it more and more difficult, more and more expensive, more and more time-consuming for a law-abiding citizen to acquire a firearm. So much cost and time and effort that those people give up, and they decide, never mind. And so again, then the good guys don't get the guns, but the bad guys have them already, and they keep them, and they use them for bad purposes. They want, this sounds conspiratorial, they want chaos. Many of these people do. And you can't have chaos when you have good guys standing by defending what's right, true, and good. And because of that, they're smart enough to realize they can't just come right out, although they would love to, and say all firearms, rifles, handguns, pistols, whatever, they're all illegal now. And you can't buy one, you can't possess one, and we're going to come and collect yours. They would love to do that, but they realize they can't. That would be a sure, even the most liberal district court judge would strike that down. But they can do these like little soft attacks. And eventually enough soft attacks, you undermine the Second Amendment so much so that we come to a point 10, 20 years from now where they do that. And people don't blink. And courts are more accepting of it. And so that's the concern. So yeah, is it an attack on the Second Amendment? It is. And I think the end goal is to undermine and get rid of the Second Amendment entirely, for sure.
So you talked about SB3 and I guess more detailed Del Toro versus Polis. So can you give us a rundown of what that is and why we're involved as well as why it's important?
So Senate Bill 3 here in Colorado was initially proposed as a semi-automatic firearms ban to ban most of the most common firearms that Coloradans have in their possession and they can acquire.
What do you categorize as a semi-automatic?
So
what is the bill or the
case? Yeah, so the semi-automatic firearms are any sort of gas-powered firearms that you pull the trigger, right, a round is expelled through the chamber, and because of the explosion, I'm not a physics guy, so forgive me on this, so I might say something that it doesn't fit the physics, but the explosion creates gas, and the energy from the gas is used to chamber the next round. So unlike, a firearm in which you have to load each round into the chamber before you fire it, you've put a magazine into a semi-automatic firearm, you've pulled the trigger, that round goes down the chamber and leaves the chamber, the next round comes up and is prepared to be fired as well. So without any other effort other than pulling the trigger again. And so those are firearms that 95% of the people want. Because why? They're easy to use, they're effective. They're effective not only in kind of the day-to-day stuff that people use firearms for, but they're effective in self-defense, right? When you're in a situation where someone is about to attack you, you don't want to have to think about loading the firearm other than putting the magazine into the firearm, and then you're good to go. You have however many rounds are in the magazine, 9, 10, 15, whatever it might be. So those are semi-automatic firearms. They are preferred by far for the vast majority of people who buy firearms. That's the type of firearm I purchased. And so because of that, this restriction really is attempting to make it extremely difficult for law-abiding citizens to get these commonly used firearms. And it imposes what I refer to as a permit to purchase scheme, which means that Polis steps in, Governor Polis steps in, and he's savvy enough to realize that a full ban would not survive constitutional review. So he says, well, let's make this, he tells the legislators, let's make this just a training requirement, a safety training requirement, so that anyone who wants to buy this gun, absolutely they can buy a firearm like this, but they have to go through training first. And that seems reasonable, doesn't it? I think the courts will agree that's reasonable. It's not reasonable because it's just a cover for something bigger and more sinister. And so the training requirement that they impose is a multi-layered, multi-month, multi-fee and assessment type situation that is going to make it very difficult for middle and lower class Coloradans to actually be able to afford a firearm. It requires them to go and request a firearms safety training card from their sheriff, which requires them to submit to a third-party vendor background check, complete an application, pay an application fee, pay the fee to the sheriff for him to determine if you're eligible to get this firearm safety card, training eligibility card. And if he agrees, deems that you're okay to have it, then he gives it to you. But that's not the end of the story. Then you have to take that firearm safety card to a training facility and get trained. And the training requirements, most of them are multi-day requirements that are expensive and that are time-consuming. After you've completed your training, then you must take and pass with a 90% score some final exam that is imposed on the person. Just to give you reference as to why 90% that's an A, right? You have to get an A on this exam to pass it. Police officers, most police officers in the state, when they're going through their post-certified training, their requirement is 70%. For the citizens who are trying to simply get permission to buy a firearm, they have to be at 90%. So standards higher than most law enforcement officers have to complete. And so that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm not a good test taker.
No, you're not a good test taker. I mean, but that's the point. Look at all those hurdles I just went through. Look at all those things you have to overcome. Look at all that money you have to pay.
And it affects so many different kinds of people as well. I mean, I was reading that there's so many different kinds of plaintiffs, and it's interesting to see how many different circumstances, and whether you're a single mother, whether you're a minority that may be under attack in the public eye and stuff like this. It's insane how many people this one bill affects.
Yeah, everybody. It affects all of us.
Yes.
But it particularly affects those of us who don't have the time or money to go and jump through all those hoops. I mean, all the things you have to do. You have to visit the sheriff's office. You have to go to find a third-party vendor to run a background check. You have to find a training program. And then most likely you're going to have to wait months because those training programs are going to become impacted, and it's going to be 3 to 6 months before you can get a training slot. Again, what if there's somebody who needs a gun immediately because of a threat they're facing immediately? You mean to tell me they have to go through all that before they can get a gun? I mean, it's ridiculous. And again, it's a cover for basically taking the Second Amendment and diluting it so much that it has no effect. And let me just say this, and then I'll stop ranting. The Second Amendment, the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, association, all the ones that are covered in the First Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, your ability not to be searched or seized without probable cause. The Fifth Amendment, your ability to remain silent and not implicate yourself and the right to counsel, and on and on and on. These are not rights that are given to us by the government. These are rights that are ours by our mere act of our birth, right? As Americans, we are given these things. And so they're enumerated in the Bill of Rights. and the government is, for the specific reason of saying, government, don't infringe on these things, don't take these rights away, except if this and this happens. And so we have got to change our mindset. That's one of the reasons I went and taught. I would teach the kids, no matter how many times I would quiz them, and whatever subject I was quizzing them about, the first question on every quiz or test would be, who or what is the source of your rights? And the response that they learned to give back to me, and hopefully internalized, was God, or nature's God, or basically my birth, if they don't believe in God. But in essence, it is something that exists naturally inside of us, and it is not a gift of the government. Because if we see it as a gift from the government, then the government can take it away, right? And in this case, if Governor Polis is the one who gives us our Second Amendment rights, well then Governor Polis can take them away, and we should be okay with that. Well, that's not okay. And SB 3 is just another example of Governor Polis and the crazies at the state legislature trying to take away law-abiding citizens' ability to keep and bear arms.
Whoa.
Sorry.
It's scary. No, it's scary. No, I mean, I'm like, oh my gosh. I was like, I'm scared right now. And I feel like I got to sign a petition after this, you know?
Just vote wisely. That's the only thing I'll say. Vote wisely.
Vote wisely.
Yeah.
Know your rights, know
Exactly.
why and who they come from, for sure. So and some people argue that these types of bans are about public safety, right? And while others say they infringe on fundamental rights, like kind of what you were just addressing. So how do you, I guess, what is your take on that on both sides of that argument?
So public safety, yeah, again, as a prosecutor, I don't want bad guys having guns. I don't want drug dealers. I don't want domestic violence abusers having firearms. I don't want the bad guys having guns. I am all for background checks. Maybe I know this probably offends somebody, the true diehards in the Second Amendment community, perhaps, but I want to know before someone is given a firearm that they are not prohibited from possessing of it because of a crime of violence that they've committed in the past or some other mental health red flag that's been put in place. And so, yeah, I don't want the bad guys to have the guns, but the best way to deal with the public safety crisis here when it comes to firearms is to ensure that the bad guys do not get the guns in the first place. And when they do get the guns, to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. 90% of our firearm homicides that occur, again, are occurring on the street violence, right? Usually gang-related violence, and it's almost always with firearms that have been illegally acquired. So when you arrest someone for shooting or killing another person, prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. Enforce the gun laws that are already on the books, of which there are many, and make sure that these bad guys are incarcerated for as long as possible and never have the right to possess a firearm again based on their conviction. That I fully support. If we start doing that across the country and not have jurisdictions like Los Angeles or Chicago or New York where you have district attorneys who seem unwilling or uninterested in prosecuting or enforcing the gun laws that are already on the books and prosecuting the bad guys with the guns, then what's the point? That's where you start on public safety. Start on what's already there. And I guarantee you if you did that, if the gun laws that are already in place, and if the bad guys are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, you would drive down the homicide rate in this country significantly. The other way you're going to drive it down is making sure that those law-abiding citizens who want a firearm get one. Because the best way to stop bad guys from guns is getting good guys, with as many good guys to have guns as well, to push back on that. And that really has been shown to also reduce gun violence. A great example of that is Houston versus Chicago. Both of them are about the same population, but Houston has a much lower homicide rate, much lower firearm homicide rate than Chicago. Why is that? Well, because in my opinion, and what the studies seem to show, is that and I forget how much more, but like 5 times more Houstonians, however you refer to people who live in Houston, Texans who live, maybe just Texans in general, possess firearms than do those who live in Chicago. So maybe it's because the bad guys in Houston realize if I'm going to go and mug that person, there's a better than 50-50 shot chance that he's got a gun strapped to his waist. And maybe I should think twice before I do that.
Probably open carry too.
Yeah, in Chicago, a very liberal blue city, your chances of finding someone with a concealed carry permit, probably you have a better chance of finding a unicorn in that state. So because of that, the criminals are emboldened. I don't fear any action I might take because the chances that the guy I'm going to attack or the girl I'm going to attack has a gun and can shoot me is slim to none. Not so much in Texas. And I think that's the reason why there's a huge difference in the firearm homicide rate in Houston versus that in Chicago. So how do you deal with public safety? incarcerate the bad guys, enforce the gun laws that are already in existence, and make sure as many good guys get guns as they want and are capable of possessing.
Confidence in defense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, I mean, that's what America was built on, right?
Yep.
You know, making sure that if there's something wrong, you at least have the ability to defend yourself.
Yeah.
So, what sort of precedent does this case in particular set for other states with similar systems in place, like Illinois, like Los Angeles, like New York?
With the system, you mean with SB3 or?
Yeah, SB3.
So what do you mind just saying that again? Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. So what sort of precedent does this set for those, I guess, more liberal cities like Chicago, like New York, like Los Angeles, compared to places like Texas? Well, I guess this is also happening in Florida, right?
Florida too. So Florida's a red state. The reason we filed a case in Florida is not because we think that Florida, particularly the current government of Florida, is anti-Second Amendment. They're not at all, for sure. But we're trying to get this matter up in front of the Supreme Court. So it's a little bit of strategy on our part. We have our Ortega in New Mexico, Garcia in Colorado are both in the 10th Circuit. And so if the 10th Circuit rules on one or both of those cases, that's great or not great, depending on how they roll. But it doesn't necessarily catch the attention of the Supreme Court. If we have the 11th Circuit, which has another firearms waiting period case, rules on that case and rules differently, well, then you have what's referred to as a split in the circuits. We also have a fourth firearms waiting period case. It's not ours, but we're watching it, and this is in the First Circuit. It's Beckwith versus Fry, which is challenging Maine's 3-day waiting period. And the First Circuit is going to weigh in on that eventually, and will likely have a third potential answer to whether or not waiting periods are lawful. When you have 3 different circuits around the country coming up with potentially 3 different answers as to whether or not a waiting period is constitutional or not, that will definitely catch the attention of the Supreme Court. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the Supreme Court, who can only take 80 cases every year of the 8,000 petitions they receive, we want to catch their attention. We want them to take this case, and we want them to hopefully make a good decision to outlaw or find these waiting period laws to be unconstitutional.
Speak up when I have a heavy hitter to make a big headline.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to. For sure, especially strategic in what we're charging. I mean, there's so many things we could file suit against. I can't even, if I lived to be 150, I couldn't file suit against all the stupid gun laws out there. But so we have to pick our battles, and this is the battle that Mountain States has picked, which is to try to help the entire country and all the states that have waiting periods, or the people who suffer under them, to not have to suffer under them anymore.
And I'm interested to ask, if you don't mind sharing, if there was any surprising or telling arguments of the opposite side, like the opposing side. Were there any, or were you surprised by any arguments that they made?
Yeah, I mean, the argument that I'm surprised about is that they say, well, the Second Amendment, if you look at the language itself, it says that you have the right to keep and bear arms. That's the actual language that's used in the Second Amendment. But it doesn't say that you have the right to acquire them. So I'm laughing because
question mark?
Yeah, it's very difficult to keep and bear something you can't first acquire, right? I mean, do you really think the founders really thought we need to throw that in there? I mean, it's
they didn't
sort
think
of
3D printers back in 1776.
Well, no, it doesn't matter. It's like you can't keep and bear something you cannot first acquire, take possession of, and so these laws are meant to limit the ability to acquire or take possession of a firearm for a certain period of time. And so when that argument was presented the first time I heard it, I thought that's ridiculous. Well, the district court judge didn't think it was ridiculous. He said, no, the Second Amendment does not guarantee a right to acquire a firearm, only to keep and bear ones you already have. Well, I won't say what I think of that. I don't think that's the right answer. And then that happened again in Colorado, where that judge also said, no, there's nothing in the plain text of the Second Amendment which says you have the rights to acquire a firearm. That to me is a surprising argument. That to me is a sure winner for us when it goes to the higher level. We had a very good decision out of the 10th Circuit on the Ortega. It was an interlocutory appeal dealing with the district court's denial of our preliminary injunction motion. And in that case, the 10th Circuit, a 3-judge panel in the 10th Circuit, found that argument is nonsense. That clearly any right that the Constitution protects includes those rights on the margin that are necessary to be exercised in order to get to that point, right? So before you can keep and bear an arm, you have to be able to acquire it. So therefore, the Second Amendment does protect acquisition as well as possession.
Do you think that'll be the sole focal point of when it does reach the Supreme Court, or do you think there will be other, different focal points throughout maybe even other cases, or just Del Toro versus Polis if it makes its way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think that's one of their many arguments. And so, no, there will be other arguments. They also say that there is a historical precedent for these types of waiting periods. And
In what sense?
in the sense that, well, just for background, in 2022, in the Bruin decision, the Supreme Court said any modern day firearm regulation needs to have an analog or an analog to a law that existed at the time of the founding, when the Second Amendment was being proposed, debated, and ratified. And if you can't find something that's analogous to the modern day law from the old period, from the founding period, then it's unlikely to survive constitutional review. And so they have also made the argument that even if you find that there's a right to acquire a firearm, the law is still constitutional because there is an analog from the founding era that supports it. In this case, they reference intoxication laws. So there were laws on the books at the time that said, if you're drunk, or if someone is drunk, they cannot use a firearm. Very few of those laws dealt with preventing someone who was drunk from buying a gun. Mostly dealt with them how they used the gun if they were drunk. We argue that that's not analogous, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that the waiting period laws apply to the entire population, not just the drunk portion of the population, not just the high portion of the population, not just the portion of the population that, I don't know, fill in the blank. It applies to everybody. Everybody has to succumb to the waiting period. These intoxication laws only applied to those who were drunk. And guess what? When you're drunk, at some point you're going to be not drunk, right? And usually that happens. We hope so, right? If you're not a full-blown alcoholic, you're going to get sober eventually. And oftentimes that happens within 12 hours of being drunk, hopefully. In this case, I don't know. I don't drink, so but I just based on my personal experience, assume that seems to be the case. But in this situation, you can't recover from the waiting period, right? It's not a condition that you have, and the gun store owner says, "Hey, I want to give you this gun, but you have this condition that has to be satisfied. So go recover from that condition and then come back and give you the gun." Well, the condition is time, and that's not a condition. It's you can't have this gun. Why? Just because we think 7 days is a good time to wait before we give you the gun. And so because of that, those are not analogous. The other law that they cited too were racist laws that existed in the early 18th century that prevented freed blacks, Catholics, Native Americans, and other minority groups from taking possession of firearms. I don't know that we should hang our hat on racist laws to support a modern day law.
It's a little bit outdated.
Yeah, it seems like that's a little bit outdated and probably not a good strategy on the part of the defense or Governor Polis or Governor Grisham down in New Mexico, but that's the strategy they've employed. So we'll see what happens. But for right now, we're in the middle of the fight and hope to, within the next 2 years, I would say, get this in front of the Supreme Court, God willing.
And looking at both of these cases as well as Second Amendment as a whole, what do you think most people misunderstand about the Second Amendment?
I think we've already kind of touched upon that first of all that it only guaranteed a right for the militia to keep and bear arms. That's absolutely not true, and the court made that quite clear in the Heller decision from 2008. I think the other misconception is that these laws are going to do something about gun violence in this country, and they're not, because again, these laws are targeted at law-abiding citizens who are going to obey the law regardless. And so because of that, I think that the anti-gun folks play on the fears and concerns of all of us. And I have fears and concerns about firearms. I don't want some crazy guy coming to my kid's school and shooting it up, right? But I also want to make sure that there's a good guy in that school if that happens to be able to push back. That good guy didn't have to wait 7 days to get his gun. So that in that lapse of period is when the shooter comes into my kid's school, that he doesn't say, I should have a gun right now, but I wasn't allowed to take possession of it. Or, in the case of California, I do have a gun, I do have a concealed weapons carry permit, but the state of California says I can't bring it onto a school campus to defend children against somebody who might attack them. I'll say this just as an aside. One of the two most recent, or both of the most recent school shootings that have occurred, one at the Christian school in Nashville about a year ago, and the other at the Catholic school up in Minnesota about a month or two ago. Both of those cases, the shooters in both of those cases, in their manifestos, they made it clear that they chose those schools because they were not armed. They did not have an SRO, a police officer on campus with a gun, and they did not have armed staff on campus. They initially chose schools that they learned did have armed staff. And because of that, they said, well, we're not going there. We're not going to a school where there's a good guy with a gun. We're going to go to a school that's completely unprotected. And that's the school we're going to shoot up. And so that's a great example of why putting guns and making sure that good guys have the ability to get guns is so important to protecting our children, protecting our society, protecting ourselves from threats we face, but most importantly, protecting our government and our country, not our government, from a tyrannical government, if and when that becomes necessary.
Confidence and defense.
Yeah,
Always
exactly.
go back to it.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to leave listeners with one question, regardless of which side they're leaning, regardless of what their argument might be, what do you think people should question or think about regarding the Second Amendment?
I think that they should question why it is that their government, if they live in a state like California or Colorado or some of these other blue states, why it is that they are so hell-bent on taking firearms out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. Is it really to reduce gun violence, or is it for some other purpose? They have to come to the conclusion on their own, but I just ask all Americans to be reflective of that. My position, I've already said it. And I think if most people were to step back and look at the reasons why they're doing this, at the same time why they're not prosecuting bad guys with guns, or they're letting them out of jail or prison early, or pardoning them, or putting that on bail, it's clear to me that they have bad intentions on the Second Amendment front. They really do. And so organizations like Mountain States, and the people like I get the privilege of working with on these cases, we are fighting hard to ensure that those governments are put in check. And that's what we're doing. And we will continue to do it.
I love that. Thank you so much, Mike. We appreciate your time. That was all the questions I had. Is there any other last points that you would like to talk about? Or
I think I ranted enough.
No, I appreciate
I rant
it.
a lot.
No, it was great.
Yeah.
A lot of great points. A lot of things that educated me on the Second Amendment, because I'm still learning this. I mean, I'm only 3 months into the legal world in general, so you made it very, very eye-opening.
I
A
appreciate it.
lot of great education, and I appreciate your time, and I'm pretty sure the listeners will also appreciate your points and your time as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you next time on our next episode of Beyond the Bench.